Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, hopefully, or welcome if you're new. This is going to be week 3 of our Analytics with Excel series. Specifically today, we are going to hone in on charts and tables. We will still be doing a little bit of formulas. So there'll be a little bit of review of the last 2 weeks. But you can be our main focus for today. Cool. All right. Okay, so things we are going to be covering today. We're going to be covering how to create and modify, we can call them static tables, regular tables in Excel. We're also going to be talking about pivot tables, which you may have used before. They'll be familiar to you if you've ever used them before. They're two different approaches to accomplishing a similar result. So we'll kind of talk about when you might want to use each one and make sure you kind of understand how to set up both types of tables. We'll talk about setting up charts that feed from your tables. And then we'll talk about kind of formatting all of our charts, tables, etc. All right. Cool. Let's get into it. All right, so just a quick review. I think there's a lot of familiar faces in here, so I think many of you have been here in the last week or two. But if you haven't, these are some of the topics that we've been talking about so far. So we talked about data formatting, we've talked about data validation, we've talked about setting up basic formulas, as well as some more complex formulas like XLOOKUP, which is very similar to a VLOOKUP, and how to combine those formulas together to accomplish your desired result. So we've covered a whole bunch. I'm going to do a little bit of review of this as we get into today, because we're going to be using some of this in our session. Just like the past couple of weeks, if you go to our little landing page for this workshop, you should see a thing for week 3 data. Should look something like this: week 3 charts and tables, big button for data for week 3. Just make sure you go ahead and download that if you haven't already, so that you'll be ready for the kind of hands-on exercise part of today. All right, cool. And then as far as our kind of hands-on data scenario for today, it's going to be a very similar data set to last week. And so last week, our data set was sort of a fictional network of lots and lots of podcasts. We've got 500 podcasts. We've got information about their categories, their advertising campaigns, how much money they make from the ads that they run, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, as a reminder, I picked this scenario because I work in podcast advertising tech. So it's an area I'm interested in. Happy to talk more about that later if anybody wants to. Okay, so just going to do a quick overview of formulas. So as a reminder, anytime you're using a formula, it's going to look something like this. It's going to be your equal sign, the name of your function, and then it's going to be some number of pieces of information that your function needs, depending on what function it is. Right? A simple function like average only takes one piece of information, which in this case is a range of cells. D to D is a whole column of cells. So that is one argument. COUNTIF is another function we're going to review today. That's a function that takes 2 arguments. That's why we've got our comma here. It's going to take in a range of cells and then a criteria to evaluate those cells. So are these cells greater than 2? And if so, how many of those cells are a number greater than 2? All right, so we're going to do a little bit of review of some of these formulas to sort of feed the first table that we're going to make. So what is this kind of table that I'm talking about? So this is to distinguish it from pivot tables, okay? Outside of pivot tables are just regular old data tables. So this is, for example, it's just some data that I made up and typed into Excel for my little coffee shop, all right? So when we're talking about tables in this sense, we're talking about typically a condensed kind of set of information where you have a clear header for every column. You may have formulas or calculations going on, right? This could be a formula that's maybe adding up the total cost of my ingredients and my overhead, for example, right? Or I could just type in the number 3. Both of these things can happen in a table. But typically, anytime you're kind of putting together a finished table, it's because you want to share that information with somebody else. And so that's the reason you want to have clear headers. And that's also the reason why you want to make sure your numbers are formatted, make sure it makes sense whether or not to display decimals, all of that kind of stuff. Is a little bit cleaner. So when you get a sheet of data, so for example, the sheet of data that I have shared with you for the purposes of this, that is kind of like a lot of rows. It's not condensed at all. That's not what I'm talking about as a table. A table is a little bit more of sort of a summary piece of information. Probably you're not going to have to like scroll to read your whole table. One way to think about it. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about formatting. There's some great built-in formatting options in Excel under a menu called Format as Table that we will talk about. All right. So I am going to do a little demo. Okay, just kind of freshen up on some of the formulas that we learned last week and the week prior, which will help us with our table exercises for today. All right. So for my little demo, I've gone back to my little fictional coffee shop. Here I've got all of the orders that have come into my coffee shop so far today. So I've had 10 orders. These are the items in those orders. You can see some orders might have multiple coffees, right? I'm buying coffee for my friends. And so I need a couple pieces of information because what I want to do is I want to summarize some information about my coffee shop. For example, I want to summarize how much money have I made so far today. I have my orders and I have my prices, but I need to do a little bit of work to understand which price goes with which order so I can run a complete total, right? I also want to be able to do a little bit of analysis of my business. I want to understand how many drinks people are ordering on average in a single order, or what's the sort of average value of an item that they're ordering. You could imagine that I might want to be encouraging people to order more expensive drinks. Maybe I make a better margin on sort of the flavored lattes than I do on the drip coffee, so that would help my business. All right, so these are the kinds of summarizing things we're going to do with tables and pivot tables today. But typically when you get your data, it's usually not ready to go directly into table format. You got to do a little bit of, munging, as we call it in the data world. And so that's what we're going to do with some of our formulas today. So this is a review from last week. The way that we get our price from our price list to our order table, this is a small table, so we could do it manually, right? We could say drip coffee matches over here, that's $3. We put $3 here, and then kind of repeat that for each row, right? But instead of doing that, we're going to use our formula, our friend XLOOKUP, which is a formula we talked about last week. XLOOKUP is a formula that takes 3 required arguments. There's some other optional ones. The 3 pieces of information that we need to give XLOOKUP to do what I just described, to grab that price. We need to give it the item that it needs to go look up in that other table. So in this case, just the item drip coffee. Then we need to give it the column where it can go search for drip coffee. So in this case, that's going to be our column G in our spreadsheet. Then we got to give it our column where it can go find the corresponding piece of information. That's going to be column H in our spreadsheet. And then if you want, optionally as a 4th thing, you can give it a little error message in case it can't find drip coffee in column G. What should it say as its error message? All right. So what I would do for that is I would give it B7 as that first thing to look up. I'm going to do my comma. I'm going to say, where should you go look for this thing in B7? And you should go look in column G. Do another comma. And then if you find that item in column G, you should go grab the associated price that is stored in column H in that same row, and that will give you your price for your item. All right, so that's our XLOOKUP formula. Pretty simple one. I'm looking at this cell, saying, all right, go look for the cell in this list, and if you find it, grab the corresponding price. Okay. Now this is another good time to use our number formatting menu. All right, so I'm going to come over into my number formatting menu in my top toolbar and just make sure I have this in some sort of currency to indicate that it's a dollar value. And then I can go ahead and copy paste this formula all the way down. I can do that either by just double clicking on my corner, or I can drag and drop, or I can do copy paste on my keyboard. All right. Now this is looking pretty good, except looks like our vanilla latte situation is getting a little dicey, probably because I don't have a vanilla latte option on my menu. So I'm going to come over here and add one, vanilla latte. Last time I got a vanilla latte, it was like $7. So let's throw that on there, and we see that because of our handy dandy formulas, this all updated. I only had to type the price in one spot, and it filled it in all 4 spots there that it was missing. All right. Any quick questions about XLOOKUP? Lingering from last week. Feeling okay about XLOOKUP. Okay, great. We won't need that one a ton today, but just want to keep it fresh. All right, the other thing we talked about last week was doing our cumulative formulas. All right, the reason it's important to learn about cumulative formulas is because that is a good way for us to practice our absolute cell reference. All right, here's what that means. So as I am receiving these orders throughout the day, I want to know how much money I've made so far, right? After these 2 copies have been ordered, I've made $6. After the 3rd copy's ordered, I've earned $13, right? I want to keep a running total. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself a range. Starting on this top cell, I'm just going to add only this one cell here since that's my very first drink of the day. But I'm going to make a really important little edit. All right, so if I just do the sum here, it's just going to take the sum of that one cell, $3, no problem. But when I copy paste this down, what I want it to do is I want it to add this other $3, right? Right now it's just sort of moving the whole thing down with me. So I'm going to put in my absolute cell reference, which is when I put a $sign right up here in front of this row number. What that's going to do is glue that row number in place so that as I copy paste down, so I'm going to delete this last thing and copy paste this down again. And when I do that and I look at this formula, I see that it's kept that 7 glued in place. That $sign has kept it there, but it's going to extend the range down as I paste it down the rows. All right, so this one will add up C7 to C8. Paste it down one more row. We can see that that one's going to add up C7 to C9, and it'll keep on coming down with me. Okay. All right, so I made $79 at my coffee shop. Pretty cool. All right, so just some basics. All right, so making a summary table. So there's a couple steps you're typically going to do when you're going to make a table that's not a pivot table, when you're going to kind of do it the static way. One important thing you're going to want to do if you're grouping information is you're going to want to remove duplicates. All right, so in this case, I want to summarize by order. Okay, I want to know per order how many drinks were ordered and what was the average price. And I can see over here that there are, in some cases, many drinks per order. So what I could do is like look with my eyeballs at the small data set and say, okay, it looks like there are 10 orders, looks like they're sequential numbers. So I could just come over to my summary table here and type in like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I could just look at them and type them all in, right? For larger data sets, that's not as good of a use of my time. So what you're going to do in that case is you're going to take this sort of column you want to summarize by, or the column you want to group by is how you could think of it. I'm going to make a copy of that and put it right over here where I want my table to end up being. And then I'm going to use one of my handy dandy data tools. So up in my data ribbon, this is that ribbon that we used in the first week to get to our data validation section. All right. I'm going to do a different thing though in my data ribbon. I'm going to go over to remove duplicates. All right. So this is a built-in Excel tool that is going to do this for me. All right. Now, typically when you select this tool, it's going to bring you a pop-up. It's going to try to help you out a little bit. It's going to say, but Rachel, you've only selected a little range for duplicates. I think there are other cells connected. I want to look in this whole range. I would recommend selecting what you know is the correct range before you get to this screen, because otherwise it can get a little confusing to sort of look at its recommendations. So I would select the part where you want to remove the duplicates and then tell it to go with my original selection. Don't try to make a suggestion, or you can look at the suggestion and see if it makes sense to you. All right, so I would say go with my original selection and remove duplicates from that column. All right, I'm going to hit OK, and it's going to give me a little summary of what it did. All right, it's going to say 5 duplicate values were found, 10 unique values remain. That makes sense because I have orders 1 to 10. Awesome. Okay, cool. Obviously, it's a little bit trivial to do it here, but super helpful when you have a much bigger data set, right? Also a great way to catch typos if you're expecting something to group by category and something spelled differently. Okay, so I'm getting a little closer to my table, right? So I have a row now for each order. And I want to know now how many drinks were included in each order, right? Again, this is a little data set I can go over with my eyeballs and say that there were 1, 2, 3, 4 drinks in order number 1, or I can do it with a formula. All right, so this is where I'm going to revisit my formula count if, all right, which is going to take 2 arguments. So my formula for count if is going to say, all right, go look over here in this range of data in column A and go look for what criteria. The criteria is that the order number matches. So in this case, I'm trying to summarize order number 1. So I'm saying go look in this range of cells in column A for any order numbers that match K6, which is this order number 1, right? It found 4 drinks. That makes sense. And again, I can copy paste this all the way down. The only thing I got to be careful of is my absolute cell reference. All right. We see if I go down to order number 2, now it's going to only look starting in A7. Right, if I go down to this next one, it's only going to look starting at A8. So at some point, it's going to start missing drinks potentially. So what I want to do is throw in my dollar signs to keep this range glued in place. I also could have had it just look at column A altogether, and then it wouldn't matter how many rows. All right, but I want to have that in place so that as I add data, I'm not at risk of losing anything as my window kind of slides down. Okay, so my table's looking pretty good, so I can get a sense of how many drinks are being ordered per order, okay? And then the last piece of information I want to grab is what is the average price per drink in each of these orders? That's something I want to work on increasing as a business owner over time. All right, so this is when I'm going to use my average if formula. All right, this is another one that we touched on 2 weeks ago, so we'll do a quick refresher. The average if formula takes 3 arguments, okay? It's going to take the range of cells you want evaluated, so the ones you want to go check and say, are these relevant to me? That criteria to check if those cells are relevant, and then your range is what you actually want to take the average of, all right? So here's what that means. So in this case, I want to say, go look at all the prices of drinks ordered in order number 1. So order number 1, matching that order number is my criteria. I want to go look at all the prices of all the drinks that were ordered, my whole order history. And then I want to take the average for the ones that meet that criteria of my price column. All right, so I can see if I slide over a little bit, it's giving me some color coding clues to sort of show me where I've selected each argument. All right, so I'm going to go look in column A, and I'm saying, all right, go look in column A. And the criteria I'm going to look for in column A is this order number right here. So anytime I see order number 1, I'm going to grab those rows and I'm going to take the average of the thing in those rows that's in column C, which is my price. All right, so that's my 3rd argument. I close my parentheses and I will see that this order number 1, those drinks were averaging $4.88 each. Say that that's because 2 people ordered drip coffees, 2 people ordered much more expensive lattes. So the average is going to be $4, right? Makes sense. All right, same thing here. I'm going to add my absolute cell references. Keep this in place. And I'm going to copy paste this on down so we can look at my different orders. Now for a drink where they've just, or for an order where they've just put 1 drink, the average is just going to be the price of that drink, right? Order number 2. The cappuccino, which is $5, my average price here, $5. Okay, last thing I'm going to do for formatting here is I'm going to change this using my home ribbon, my number formatting menu to currency. So I'm getting my nice dollar signs and they're all evenly lined up and all of that. I'll remove my little, scoop my little header down because I have a note that I forgot to delete before I started this. All right. Get rid of that, let's get this down. Okay, and now I've got my little table, right? This is my summary table. This is what I was trying to achieve. This is why I went and did my little lookup formula here so I could have the price, so I could get to my nice little summary. Now, the very last thing I'm going to do is my handy little format as table button. All right, so that is going to be over here in my home ribbon. It might be over on the right, depending on your screen size. It's going to be format as table. Little icon with a little paintbrush. I'm going to come here and that's going to give me this lovely pop-up with all these different fun ways I could format my table. Some of these are just, aesthetic. So I just, like this one. It's going to ask you if your table has headers. You should always click yes, because your table should have always had headers. All right, and you're gonna hit OK, and it's gonna do some nice stuff for you. It's gonna kind of make the kind of backgrounds, borders all the same, etc. And it's gonna add in our little kind of sort filter options for us as well. All right, so anytime you're summarizing data that you want to share with somebody, it's always great to get it formatted like this, right? So you've got clear headers, you've got, if it's money, it's formatted as dollars or percents, whatever you need, and you format it as a table. So it's a little easy to read, easy for them to come in and say sort by, largest to smallest. You could come in and play with your data a little bit. Okay, any questions about how we got from sort of our initial data set to this table? Generally following along. Great. All right, so we are going to switch to our first activity of our session, which is going to be to have you all make a very similar table to this one I just made from our podcasting data. All right, so we already talked about this, clear header, make sure things are formatted, and then you're going to use that format as table button at the end. All right, so this is what we're going to do. We want to summarize some information about all of these podcasts in our network by category, right? All of our podcasts have a category. They might be education or health and fitness or news or whatever else, okay? So what I would like you to do is create a summary table of all of those shows by category. All right, so first thing you're going to need to do is make a list of those categories. You can use that remove duplicates tool that I mentioned before. And the first thing we just want to know is how many shows are in each category in our network. Of our 500 shows, how many are news, how many are health and wellness, et cetera. And then I also want to know for each category, how many monthly downloads are those shows getting on average? So on average of all of our news podcasts, how many monthly downloads are they getting? Now, as a reminder, your data set should be on our little kind of class landing page here, data for week 3. When you open that up, you should see something like this. For this exercise, we are going to focus on this shows tab. All right, so make sure you download a copy of this to use for yourself. What you're going to do is hop over to our summary tab, which is blank, and you're going to create your table here. Okay, so your table should end up, this is a little bit small, the numbers don't matter, but your table should end up looking something like this, right? Not a ton of rows, just one row for each different category, your number of shows, and how many average monthly downloads for shows in that category. Okay. So you're going to need remove duplicates, you're going to need count if, you're going to need average if. Those are the 3 pieces I just talked through. If you need help with the formula, remember you can go to your insert formula or insert function button and you can kind of get your little helper pop up. So you're going to want to start by just doing this. And then once you get to the end, then you can do the sort of formatting pieces. First, focus on getting sort of the rows and columns that you want for your table. So I'm going to give you all a few minutes to work on your table. I'm going to kind of float around. If you need help, get stuck, give me a little wave and I'll help you out. Cool? All right. Like this is like if you copy this entire just like paste it there, and then you can do the
All right, looks like a few folks may be a little stuck on the first part with getting sort of our duplicate categories removed. So I'm going to walk through that. Okay. So I want to grab a list of all my categories. All right. So in my shows tab, I have a category for all of my 500 shows, and I want just the unique list of these. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just copy all of these categories over to my summary table. All right. Or my blank summary tab, become my summary table. All right. I'm going to copy over just the categories because I don't need any of this other stuff. I'm not worried about the titles. I'm not worried about anything else right now. Okay. So I'm just going to grab my category column. And then I'm going to use the data part, my data ribbon. Still got my whole column selected here. And then I'm going to choose remove duplicates. All right. If you don't see this remove duplicates button, it might be in the little dot, 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 just depending on your screen. It'll be a little similar icon with a little red X. All right, and it's going to ask me which columns. I just have the one column. It's going to ask me if my data has headers. I should say yes, because my data should always have a header. All right, and it does category. All right, so I'm going to say yes. And then it's going to tell me, all right, great, 489 duplicate values found and removed, 11 remain. Okay, so I've got 11 categories. And in fact, looks like one of those is blank. That's probably a data quality problem with my source. So I would probably just not worry about that blank one and just worry about these 10. All right, so that's that first step here, or I guess these first two steps of our process. So you should have something after those first two steps that looks like this, just a short list of these categories. If you wanted to, you could scroll through all the shows and manually look for those 10 categories yourself. You could try to filter, look at them here, type them in based on this list. So there's a few different ways to do it, but this way is the fastest typically for me. So you should have something that looks like this, and then that's where you should be adding your count if and your average if, which are going to tell you how many shows and how many average downloads are in each. Okay. So I have my categories. I should be adding 2 more columns here for my number of shows and my average monthly downloads, and that's where I'm going to use my count if
and my average is. Okay, give everybody a couple more minutes.
Yeah, totally. So you get a little bit of a hint if you go to insert here and then you do. Yeah, and then insert function. And then if you, so COUNTIF over here will give you a little bit more of a description of what it's looking for.
Oh,
So if you're using a new formula, that's always a handy
Okay.
thing.
So
So
you just did that by going to, you did that.
formulas, insert function, exactly. Yep, and you can search any of the functions. It has a whole list. You can
Oh,
scroll through.
nice.
Yeah, okay, because you've already typed this one in, it already popped up with this one, which is
Mhm.
great. Okay, so you're gonna give it two pieces of information. You're gonna give it the range where you want it to go look for, in this case, true crime.
Okay.
And then you're gonna tell it that you wanna go look for true crime. All right, so range is our range of cells. And then criteria is the criteria that you want it to meet, which in this case is just to match that value.
Okay, so am I putting just like true?
So that's gonna be your second argument is selecting that cell. Your first argument, you need to go tell it the column to go look for that value. So where's the column that you wanna go look and count everything in?
Would that be like looking at some of these?
Yeah,
or-
that'll be in shows, perfect. So it's this whole G category.
Okay.
So you essentially wanna count how many times does true crime show up in this column? That's gonna be your number of true crime shows, right?
Okay, yeah.
So you go ahead and select that whole, just G, that whole thing. Perfect. Then you're gonna, yep, and then your second argument right there is what you want it to go look for in column G.
So how many times it shows up? Is that what you mean?
Well, so all we've said, all we've told it so far is just go look in column G. We haven't said what to look for.
Oh, so true.
Yes, which you could type in yourself, or you can just tell it A2 and it'll just go find
Oh,
the thing that's in A2.
so just say that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, perfect. All right, and then we got 44. Pretty cool. Bravo.
Gotcha.
All right, and then similar for average if. So you want to look it up on your formula builder and then it'll give you some tips.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
No problem.
Susan shows me get it. I need a couple times.
It's not, it doesn't handle blanks quite like that, so
Someone do the drill and I was like,
typically,
didn't. catch
probably in
any
this
of
case, in the real world, what you want to do is
Yeah.
go back and
Yeah.
fill in the categories on your show tab.
that. I need a
In this
couple more
case,
runs.
You don't know that, so you could just sort of skip this blank row or delete it. Yeah.
And one more
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I was wondering how to do this average. Is it like?
Yes, good question. So if you go to your formulas tab on the top here,
Just average.
yes, but if you go to formulas on your top and then if you insert, it'll give you a little kind of paper slider on the side. So if you scroll down on this, it'll explain.
It should be average.
And just let's just scroll down.
Oh, there's.
We can.
Oh, weird. Okay, I guess it's doing it as a little pop-up. Perfect. So that it tells you the three pieces of information that it needs.
Yeah, I can try, but I think this is like for me.
Gotcha, okay.
We're just for range, and I choose. I choose like. this.
Great, fantastic.
And then.
Did you just click on it? Oh.
Criteria. True crime.
Right. None.
Okay, yep, you just want to select it on, or you want to select it here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Just here, and then for average
Yep.
range, I choose,
This
from
one?
G, top one.
So you figured out.
Like Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
that should
you.
work.
It's like you should.
I wanna sort it.
I don't know, you tell me.
But then it messes up.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
six digits.
When you try to make it descending.
So I went to make a table.
Well, maybe if I do it like.
Ah,
Am
okay,
I
so you're doing
second?
a create table. What you want is format as table. So in your home ribbon,
I see.
there under the dot, you should hit. This one with a little paintbrush. Yeah, there you go.
I see.
Yeah. You don't want to insert a new table because then you'll overwrite everything you just did.
No wonder, okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Good question.
Oh wait, it still did the same, it's still like over. Right, my stuff.
Oh, yeah, so you got an issue with your count if here. So your count if. The first argument to your count if should just be this one value, not this whole list. Okay, because that you want it to just go look for true, in that row, you only want it to go look for true crime.
I
The next row down, you want it
see.
to go for.
Okay, so just choose that
Yeah.
first one.
Yeah, and that
the
should fix your
first
formula.
the
Yes, that one,
first
that first
range
argument
has
shouldn't be a
to
range,
match
it
Just
should be a
vision
single
two.
cell.
Oh, it
Okay.
does.
Yeah,
So the first range should be the category.
Try that.
And then
but
it's
no
gonna
dollar
be-
sign.
Right,
The
because why
other
would we need a
range
dollar
is
sign? We
the-
wanted it to always look at that row. Yep, and then try pasting that all the way down. Let's try that.
Cause like,
What's going on?
oh, I guess it's like similar to the sum if, like this is where
Okay,
it has to
do you have
look for something that matches the criteria.
might-
Even if it
you might have
matches the
the wrong
average,
Pop up.
the corresponding value. So it's like, it needs to first see.
Yeah,
if it
so you have the right,
matches
so
true
should the range is
crime.
I
first
see.
criteria is the right.
And then the criteria. So that should be like true. Yeah, or like it should be like that cell. Just the one cell.
Yes.
And then what, it'll apply that to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then, did you also use like the,
That you give it the sex range. So. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to know about that, like, I think when you're.
No, actually, no, you're using the whole column, so I think it's
You wanna
fine.
give it ranges that are like the same length.
Yeah,
so that it
because
will
it's not
go
like.
Oh, I mean, like I need, like, when you fill out. when you, like,
See if you can like
give it
sort it by.
a-
job. Oh my god, what did you do?
How would it- But it's like in.
Yes, because it's looking in the same row. So here's what it's doing. It's saying, okay, I'm gonna go to column G. I'm gonna look for the value technology. When I find the value technology, I'm gonna find that same row. of
Maybe there has to be
columns,
a way
and
to,
that
like-
same row, and that thing is like built in.
So that's, oh, that's what.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't have to specify that.
It's sort.
All right, does anyone have their count if working, their number of shows working? You do, yeah? All right, you wanna tell us what you got? All right, number of shows, so I'm gonna put in a little header. All right, what you got for your number of shows formula?
So I.
Count if.
Equals count if, fantastic.
And then. First. The show, sheets.
Great.
And then select. Category,
Yep,
whole
so
column.
the whole column, so this whole column G, right? I wanna go look in this whole column. Fantastic.
The second argument, I select, the very first category.
First category, right, because I'm over here in cell B2 and I'm saying for B2, I just want to see the true crime, right? I want to go look for all the times that true crime shows up in my full show list. That'll be my number of shows that are in the true crime. All right, fantastic. All right, 44 true crime shows, lovely.
And then I can paste this all the way down. A little trick for pasting is if you hover right on this lower corner until your little cursor changes color and you double click, it'll just paste on all the way down, which is a fun way to look cool in front of your coworkers. Okay, any questions about count if? All right. Fantastic. All right, our next step is our average monthly downloads per category with our average if. Who's got an average if?
So we do for the range, select the category.
Hang on, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. What did
Oh,
you,
yeah, sorry, so we do, equal sign average.
equal sign average if, fantastic. All right,
And for range, we select the category.
fantastic. All right, so the range of cells, so we're gonna do our category column over here.
And we give the criteria of that, like, of one specific category.
Perfect, so comma, and then I'm gonna go same thing I did with my count if, right? In that column G, I wanna go look for just this one specific value, my true crime, that's my criteria.
And, for like average range, we select the number of, like, the monthly down.
Yes, the column I actually wanna take the average of, right? So I come back over to this column and it's hidden by my little preview thingy here. All right, I want to take the average of my column F, right? Because that's where my actual numerical information is, right? So it's gonna say every time I find true crime in column G, hop over to that same row in column F, grab that number, do that all the way down, and then take the average of all those numbers. Okay, fantastic. All right, great. I'm gonna get an average monthly downloads. I'm gonna paste that on down, if I can use my mouse. Go down instead of sideways. Okay, there we go. All right, pretty cool. Got my little summary table. All right, now I'm gonna do a little bit of formatting cleanup. What's some kind of formatting cleanup I should do on this table? Whole numbers, fantastic. There's not a super meaningful concept of a partial download, okay, as in this context. So I want this to be a whole number. So to do that, I'm gonna come back to my home ribbon. It should be somewhere next to my number formatting menu. I'll see my little decimal options. All right, so I'm gonna do decrease my decimal a few times until that goes away. My numbers look a little cleaner and tidier, okay? And then last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna format this whole thing as a table. So it's got some nice headers and all of that. So I'm just gonna select everything. If you click in any cell of your little table and then you do Command A, it'll automatically just grab the sort of like connected block of cells that has numbers. It's a little trick. All right, so I'm gonna grab that whole chunk. I'm gonna come in my ribbon. You should have something that's got a little kind of grid with a paintbrush on it. That'll be format as table. All right, so I'm gonna find my little grid with paintbrush, format as table. And I don't know, I feel like I like green today, so I'm gonna pick this green one. Yes, my column has headers. Of course it has headers. All right, fantastic. And great, it's gonna do some nice formatting for me. Maybe I wanna even be a little fancy and I wanna sort it and I wanna say, all right, which of these categories tends to have the most monthly downloads? Looks like it's our technology podcast. All right, so you can do any little sorting from these little drop downs, sort largest to smallest, sort alphabetically, etc. All right. Okay, any questions about formatting? Step there. Any lingering questions about count if, average if?
When I do the sort, it seems to mess up my formulas.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
I was wondering, like, is there a different way I'm supposed to do it so that it sorts by the number and like maintains the formula?
Ah, okay, very good. Good question. One thing that can be tricky is if you were missing, like if you didn't select your entire columns here, if you were just doing your kind of like ranges of cells, that's something that can get a little funky with the sort. So if you're having that, I would say maybe just go and grab, good moment to just grab the whole column. That'll
I will
usually
try
solve a lot of it. If it's not that, that's probably the most common reason that would be. Yeah, so what she's talking about is the difference between just selecting G:G, which is that entire column, or you could also come in here and select G2 through, you know, G5 501 or whatever this is, right? So you could select that specific range or just say all of column G. All of column G is a little bit more forgiving for any times that you might be sorting or manipulating your sheet. So that's probably a smarter option for this situation.
And how did you clean up the decimal points again?
Yes, good question. So anytime if you have decimal places that you do or do not want, up in your toolbar should be somewhere around your number format dropdown. You should see, it might be in a little sort of dot menu also, but you should see some little zeros with arrows like this. Those can be used to increase or decrease your number of decimals in either direction.
Thank you.
All right.
So, like, I'm kind of having the same issue with like the formulas being messed up when I sorted.
Okay.
So I'm getting like all the numbers right, but like I did select like the whole column, but I'm not getting like the numbers are not matching up with the category. If that makes sense.
Interesting. I need to take a look here to understand what's happening with that.
So maybe like when I guess. So here it says change. There. So I can use here sort it. Like, it's still J4, but like I'm getting the same numbers at you, but like they're not matching.
I think you made, so technology is at the top here, and then if you switch the sort to smallest to largest, just switch the sort back.
Well,
please. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so technology went to the bottom, numbers went back.
Getting like 51.
Yeah, the numbers, your numbers might not match exactly
Oh,
my demo.
oh,
Yeah,
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 sure.
yeah,
Oh,
don't, so,
okay.
yeah, don't worry about the
I thought
numbers
about-
exactly matching.
Sure.
I might have messed up my demo data, there could be all kinds of stuff, but yeah, so you do, what we were just looking at is if you are sorting up and down, you should have things matching. Out of the way. Okay. So, all right, so just a quick run through of what we just did. So we used remove duplicates to get our individual list of categories. We did count if, average if, couple kind of these simple conditional formulas to kind of summarize our information. And then we did some like nice formatting to clean up our final table. All right, so as we're already starting to notice from the questions, right, these tables can be a little nitpicky as you get, towards additional edits. If you maybe are adding data, adding rows, et cetera, you might run into something weird if you sort or if you are adding a column, depending on how you did your cell references. These are all reasons that these could get a little touchy. All of these are reasons that if you're running into those problems a lot, it might actually be better to use a pivot table in that situation. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So everything that we just did, you can make any table in Excel using basically what we just did, right? So kind of figure out how you want to format your data, write your little formulas to get it how you want, and then do some nice formatting. Done. Many times that is sufficient, especially if you want it to look really polished. That's a great way to do it. Pivot tables are great because they're a lot more flexible. They don't like look quite as aesthetically clean at times. So depending on what you're trying to go for, you may or may not want to use them for that reason. But functionally, they're very useful and much easier than what we just did. All right, much more flexibility. So we are going to walk through that. So pivot tables essentially have a lot of these formulas built in. So they'll let you group by kind of whatever criteria you want your table, and they can do things like sum, average, minimum, maximum, any of those things you could do with a formula are kind of already built in options to a pivot table. I think it's helpful to make at least one table yourself first so you can sort of understand and appreciate what a pivot table is doing, but also so you can kind of see how it's working under the hood, right? Under the hood, a pivot table is doing all of that work that we just did, okay? All right, the reason pivot tables are so great is once you make them, they are extremely easy to quickly change and change back to how you want them, change the format. You don't have to rewrite things like formulas. Okay, so we're gonna play with pivot tables a little bit. And I'm gonna show you a very simple pivot table on my little demo data. All right, so I've got my little coffee shop data right here, and I am gonna insert a pivot table. I'm gonna do that from my ribbon up here next to home. I have insert pivot table. Note that I've already selected my data first. You always wanna select your data first. Then I'm gonna insert a pivot table. it usually defaults to put it on a new worksheet, which is a good idea. We'll get into why that's a good idea in a second. All right, so I'm gonna walk through this as a demo and then I'll give you a chance to do this on your own, another exercise, okay? So I've selected my data, I'm inserting my pivot table in a new worksheet. I'm gonna hit OK. And it's gonna give me a little workspace to use. All right, so it's gonna give me a little summary of all the fields that I had in my previous data set. All right, and it just grabs these from the column headers. Right, so that's another great reason for all your data to have headers, because if you don't have headers, this part is not gonna be as handy. All right, so I could do things like drag and drop any of these values, any of these sort of sets of information into the rows or columns or values of my table. So you'll remember before in my demo, I made this little table where I summarized by order, okay, with just number of drinks ordered and average price. I'm gonna accomplish that same thing in a pivot table. All right, so I'm gonna group, so I want my rows to end up being orders. So I'm just gonna drag my order number down into this rows section, little drag and drop, and boom, it's already done that first step we did before where we did our whole remove duplicates thing, okay? Now I'm gonna add some values, all right? So I'm gonna say, let's put my items in here and it's just gonna default to counting up my items, all right? So item number 1 had 4 items, order number 1 had 4 items, order number 2 had 1 item, etc. So just with some dragging and dropping, I'm already accomplishing what my count if was doing before. Same thing, if I want my average price, I can make that another value. It's gonna default to a sum of the price, which actually doesn't quite add up to what I want it to be in this situation, but I can change the settings. All right, so it's defaulted to summing up the price of the items in that order, which could be useful for something else. I wanted the average. So I'm just gonna come in here to my settings and swap from sum to average. I'm gonna hit OK, boom, and it's gonna do that. And I can just check, right, for order number 1, it got an average of 488, and my table, order number 1, average of 488. Okay, so I can see that it's matching, it's doing exactly the same thing, made exactly the same table, but it's super flexible here. So if I decide I wanna switch this to sum, I don't have to change my formula. I just come in my settings, do this, good to go. I could do all kinds of other useful stuff in here, like change how I display this information. So instead of showing this as a sum, for example, I could show this as a % of all my daily orders, right? Of all my daily orders, what % of my revenue was that first order? So they actually made up like a quarter of my revenue for today. That's big, because I made $80 and they were $20 order. Right, so that was super simple. I didn't have to think about my % formula. I didn't have to go and write that, right? Super easy to switch around and change. So I have lots of options with the pivot table. Now, the downside is the options can be a little overwhelming. There are a ton of options, including a ton that aren't super commonly used or that you might not, need. So that can start to get a little overwhelming with pivot tables, but in general, right, this is way faster than the first time I made this table doing it manually, right? All right, last thing I will note about this is that in order to get sort of my price information here, I did still need to have matched up my price to my order table. So the pivot table did not replace my need to do this X lookup that I did before, right? So I still would have needed to do that part, but it replaced the need to do sort of this part, my remove duplicates, my count if, my average if. Okay, that's the part the pivot table replaced. All right. Okay. So that's a little preview of pivot tables. About them a little bit more. Okay, so the reason that you should typically put your pivot table into a new workbook is because that they can change shapes as you are working with them. So let's say that instead of grouping my table by order number, I actually want to group it by item. All right, I actually want to look at how many of each item was ordered and what % of that was my revenue. All right, so suddenly my table's only 4 rows long. All right, so I might now have, some really important notes that I type here, but then I might decide I want to change my pivot table back to how it was before, right? I want to look at it by order and not by item. All right, but now it's going to tell me this. Now it's going to say, oh, you can't change it back because you've got other info. I've got some other text or some other data that I've typed in elsewhere in that sheet. And it knows it's about to overwrite that if it sort of reshapes itself. So it's usually about to have pivot tables just on their own tabs so you can avoid this kind of issue. Okay, great. So the kind of field builder, let's see, my demo. Okay, so this thing over here is kind of your pivot table builder or your field list, your field menu, which just works as a drag and drop. So you can drag and drop things when you have a more complicated data set, right? You have more options. I find that the best way to think about this is just to try to visualize what you want to end up with and then kind of work backwards. So if you know you want your table by order, okay, that would mean I want my orders in rows. Okay, so rows and then kind of drag and drop, right? So you usually want to kind of like think about it backwards from how you want your end table to look. I find that's the most helpful way to think about it, but you'll get the hang of it as you kind of drag and drop and see how things change, okay? All right, and yeah, as you're doing all the drag and drop, you'll see the changes immediately, so that'll make sense. This is what it looks like on a Mac, also similar in Google Sheets. The layout's just a little different, but same thing. So the main things you're looking at, I would say mainly start with your rows and values are the first things to play with, and as we'll get into the kind of filters and stuff as well. Okay. All right, and then this is this last piece I was talking about. So once you have a few values in your table, you can change how they show up, right? It'll probably default your number to a count or a sum. But if you want an average or a maximum, for example, you can hit the little, I think on this one, it's a little eye icon. Yeah, in mine, it's a little down arrow. I think on Mac, it's a little eye icon right there. You can hit that to get to your settings, and that's where you can change sort of what your formula is, or whether you want to show it as some sort of percent, like that. All right, and then the last thing, so you can do same thing, you can do your sorting. So you'll notice that there's not a little sort thing on each of these column headers. There's just a little sort option here. But I can do my same. I could sort these just alphabetically if I wanted to. I could sort them the other way alphabetically. And I could also sort them by my values from here. All right, so if I wanted to sort them by sum of price, I can come down to sort by value. And then I can just tell it to sort by my sum of price here. All right, so same sorting I can do in a regular column kind of sort. It's just a little different because it's only over here on this left-hand side. All right. So our next part of the activity is we're going to do exactly the same table that y'all just made, but with a pivot table. And this is going to be hopefully much simpler and faster than the table that you just made. So I want you to select all the data in the Shows tab and insert a new pivot table. All right, and you're going to want to do a pivot table where each row is that category, and then your values are the number of shows and the average monthly downloads. So same sort of end result that we just made, but you're going to do it as a pivot table. Okay, so I would say maybe just start with this very first part. If this is the first time you made a pivot table, we get a little fancier as we go. But you want to insert your pivot table after you've selected all your data. So all the data that we're summarizing for this one is going to be on your Shows tab. So you want to select all of this, insert pivot table. All right, make sure you put it in a new sheet, and then you can start playing with how you want it laid out, dragging and dropping, seeing how you want the layout to look. All right, and your goal should be to get it to look like the final table from the last exercise. So a row for each category, column for number of shows, and a column for those average monthly downloads. Cool? All right, I'm gonna give you all a few minutes. I'm gonna float around and answer questions. How would you get it, just if you were looking with your eyeballs at the show tab, how would you get the number of shows? Perfect. So you would just count the number of rows that have stuff in them, right? You wouldn't count any of the blank rows. You kind of count all the rows that had stuff in them, and then you'd stop when they started being blank, right? So you can count any of these things that are filled in on every show. So in this case, every show has an ID. So you can add another value.
Just drag and drop. So you can have multiple values. And it probably doesn't make sense to add up IDs, but
Right.
yeah.
So just, oh, and.
Yeah.
So the field would just be count.
yeah, so this, you just want to make sure you're picking a field that's not blank for you. So it is.
Thank you. And then a question also, how? It's the same way. Change this. Not being hold on. So many numbers to change into a whole.
Oh,
number.
your decimals, that should just be here in your decimals. May not be able to call on that one. So this is like formatting stuff, you can get a lot more specific with the type of, that we just did.
Okay.
But flexibility wise, you get a lot more further with
Okay.
these. So it's kind of-
Sounds good.
All right. If you're feeling good about your pivot table, you can try messing around with it a little bit. All right, you could try splitting your rows or your columns by some other piece of data from our data set. All right, so if I look at my shows tab, I might have some other, I can sort it by category, monthly downloads. You can start making a pivot table from some of our other data. This is stay anymore, so I'll get rid of this guy. Okay. All right. But in general, your pivot table should be coming together much quicker than our last one. So if you feel like you're stuck or it's taking a lot of time, you might be doing something wrong. So give me a little wave if that's the case. Thank you. You can have multiple values. You can drag multiple things into your values section of your builder. So you can drag the downloads in there to get the average, and you can drag any other column in there to get a count. I would recommend ID since it's not blank. All right, who's got an initial pivot table set up? Feeling like it's working. Couple people. All right, you want to tell us how you set yours up? Select the whole thing. All right, I'm going to do Command A on my keyboard.
And select pivot table.
Insert pivot table. Great. All right,
And drag the category into the row.
category into rows. Okay, great. Off to a strong start.
Download into value.
Monthly downloads to my value section.
Can change it to average.
All right, so defaulted to sum. So I'm going to click my little arrow next to it here in my value options. I'm going to go to my value field settings. And I'm going to change it here to average. Fantastic.
And check the category again.
Down to values. All right, perfect. Count of category. Great.
Change the number to reduce the number after the dot.
Reduce our decimals here, so I can come down here and get rid of some decimals. Great. I think someone else is noting, I think this doesn't work for pivot tables. If you select the whole column for some reason, you do have to select the specific cells to work with pivot tables. All right, very good. We got a pretty nicely little formatted table. Came out pretty similar to our summary tab here that we made. Awesome. All right. Let's see. Other I have to say about this. Yeah, so as far as the count, you can count any
of these columns, right? As long as all these columns are filled in for all your data, you can sort of count any of them. So I could count ID, I could count first name, I could count last name, doesn't really matter. In general, I would recommend counting either the thing that you're grouping by, so in this case category, which is good, or something you know for sure is filled in on every row, like an ID. Or like an email, right? If you might be like missing last names for some people, it wouldn't be great to count by last name because then you wouldn't count those rows if they were blank. All right, great. Okay, it's a little faster, a little easier than the way we did the same table earlier. Yes, okay, great. All right, next task on here is to change our number of shows column to display the percent. So instead of the number of shows, I want to know what percent of my shows are in each category. As a reminder on my little demo sheet, this is where I change my price to show as my percent here. So I'm going to come down to my little values, mess around with my value field settings. Sorry, I'm going to give everybody a second to try that. I want that number of shows column to display as a percent of the total shows instead of just the number of shows. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's good. So you can have multiple things in your values. So you can drag another of these items down into that. I would recommend ID because you know it's filled in. Yeah. Perfect. So it's going to add up the ID, which for an ID number doesn't really make sense. Right, it defaulted to the sum. So you might want to change it. You're right, Pat. We just instead of we want the number of shows, so we would just want the count. Yeah. Yeah, you're just going through and counting how many of them have an ID. Okay.
Oh, right, and then we like, she just changed the felt name to like, no.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you could change it there. People often don't for pivot tables.
Oh.
Because they're just kind of like all auto generated like
I
that.
actually did listen first, but then I was a bit confused. So I.
Oh, no, you had it right. You're all good. All right, so the next little sort of trick is can you get that column to display as a percent? Okay. All right, did anyone get the number of shows to display as a percent? Here in my pivot table I just made, and instead of knowing that 49 of these shows are arts, I want to know what percent of all my shows are arts shows. How do I get that to display as a percent? All right, great. So once I click out of my pivot table, you'll see my little field sort of browser thing disappears. I just click back on my pivot table to get it to show back up. Okay,
And you would go to values and count category,
great.
to value field settings,
Value field settings,
show value as.
show value as, right? So here I've got my main sort of sum count average list, but I can also toggle over to some more complicated options. Great.
Drop down to percentage of grand total.
Fantastic. Percent of grand total. Lovely. Hit OK. Great. And I will learn that about 10% of my shows are arts, which there were 49 of them, and I know I have 500 shows, so that roughly makes sense. Cool. All right. And now that I've done that, it's super easy to come back and just change it back if I want. So if I want to get rid of that percent, I just come back to this exact same place and change it back to no calculation in this show value part. And I'm right back where I was. All right, cool. All right, now how would I figure out from this pivot table how many total monthly downloads we get from news shows? What would I do with that pivot table to figure out how many total monthly downloads we get from news shows?
add another column, use the monthly downloads
Great, monthly downloads,
and choose the sum.
sum, perfect. Mine just defaulted to sum, so even easier. Fantastic. All right, so all I did was just add downloads again as a value, right? So I've got one place where I'm doing the average of the downloads and one place where I'm doing the sum of the values. That's totally fine. All right, so I can see I tend to get, what is this, like 1.4 million, 14 million, 1.4, 1.4 million monthly downloads for my news shows. All right, now these are especially great if you are trying to go back and forth with somebody about your data or your analysis. I personally have had many cases where my boss might tell me that he wants to know something by the average, and then I show it to him and he actually wants to know the range, or he actually wants to know the total or whatever, right? These are exactly the kinds of things you tend to go back and forth on analysis. So pivot tables are really, really great to just kind of figure stuff out. Now, some of you might have noticed if you tried to get into like the formatting or renaming the headers or whatever, that is like a little bit more nitpicky on pivot tables than it is on the tables we were just doing, because those are just more straightforward formatting. So typically, if you want to be like a little bit fussier with the kind of formatting and you're not going to manipulate the data further, the previous type of table we did is a great option. If you're going to be like playing with stuff, changing stuff, working with other people, pivot tables are definitely the way to go. So you can use either, whichever you're more comfortable with, whatever makes more sense based on your context. The other thing I will say, everything we've talked about can be done in Google Sheets. I think I saw a few people using Google Sheets. The little kind of pivot table builder menu looks a little different on Google Sheets. So if you're stuck, let me know, but it does accomplish all the same things that we just did. So you can do all of this on Google Sheets as well. I will say the pivot table formatting on Google Sheets is like a little clunkier even than this. But that's in there. Okay. Any questions about pivot tables? Yeah.
The filters box at the top, is that so that we could filter any one of those columns? So would we
Yes.
just put all those, we only have category right now filtered, so if we wanted to filter
Yes.
by any one of those, we would just drag it over to
Great
filters?
question. Yeah. So if we wanted to filter, for example, by category, that moves it into like a bit of a bigger filter drop down. So the kind of this is reminiscent of the data validation drop downs we did in the very first session. But here it'll kind of give me this as its own little menu. I could say just comedy and hit apply, and then it's going to update all what's left of my table to just filter by comedy. So it's kind of a different filtering.
Okay.
I can just bump it right back to my rows. And then it'll kind of carry that filter with it if I do that. And then I could remove the filter from here. So it just kind of depends on personal preference, how you want to filter. What you like. Okay, how are we feeling about pivot tables? Feeling okay? There's lots of options in there, lots to play with. You'll kind of like find that a lot of the more advanced options in there are not very commonly used unless you're like doing a lot of day-to-day spreadsheets. The types of kind of quick tables we just made are very common. All right, okay, last thing to know about kind of setting up your pivot table. So once you've got a pivot table going, once you're like clicked into it, into one of the cells, and you've got your kind of field builder popping up on the side, you'll also get a special part of your ribbon. So you'll get this little thing up here, mine showing up in green, called pivot table. You'll see if I click out of my table, that actually disappears. So it's a special thing that only appears when I'm inside my pivot table. All right, so when I'm inside my pivot table, I get this whole special extra ribbon with some more options. All right, this gives me some stuff I can play with. My field list, for example, I could turn off if I really don't want to see it for some reason. I can turn it on and off from this toolbar. I can also move my pivot table. You'll find that once you're building one, it's kind of hard to copy and paste it because it's got its own sort of built-in sense of location. But there's a special button here that I can move my pivot table. I can change the color of my pivot table if I want. Can I change it to green? Let's try green. So I could change my color, much like our format as table menu. All right, so I just get a few additional kind of options up here. All right, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more depth. Okay, but that's kind of my special ribbon. I can only get to it when I've already clicked into my pivot table. If you're on desktop, it's going to sort of expand out into two menus. It sort of collapses them if you're on the web version. All right, so the other reason that pivot tables are cool is because you can use them to make pivot charts, which is very exciting. So pivot charts are essentially sort of a smarter version of kind of a standard chart that you might have played with before in PowerPoint or Excel. These always kind of remind me of like a middle school report of some kind when you're like making a bar chart, right? So pivot charts we can make from pivot tables, and they have all the same benefits of pivot tables, meaning I can change stuff, I can kind of drag and drop, and it's pretty easy. Okay, and same charts kind of have the same back and forth that we did with our tables, right? So we could either kind of make a table ourselves or just kind of throw together a pivot table. Same thing with a chart. We can do a pivot chart, or we can just sort of make a more traditional chart. So let's go. Yeah, all right, let me go back over to my demo here. All right, great. Here is my pivot table. And I would like to do a chart from my demo data for you. Let's do this. So if I wanted to make just sort of a standard chart from my data, right, I would just come to my insert menu up here and I would just pick a chart format. So in this case, I might pick sort of my pie chart. This would need some cleanup, but you know, I could start kind of playing here with how I want my chart to be laid out. All right. Not cooperating. Okay. Oh, I can get this in there. Okay. All right. Let me pause on that. Okay, but so once you have your pivot chart, which should be sort of a similar insert. It's a little different on the web, which I use a little bit less frequently, and I meant to pull up a example of this on my desktop version just to have it ready, but I did not. So pivot charts are going to be very similar to your original charts, but like I said, they're going to have kind of the same drag and drop benefit that our tables do, which is awesome. Okay. And the formatting piece kind of applies as well. So the formatting is more kind of auto-generated with your pivot charts and tables. It's going to be a little bit more manual if you're doing it sort of the static way. Might be beneficial if that's your final product, just kind of depends, right? So what I would like you to do is to practice making a pivot chart and or a regular chart from your data. All right, now I didn't do a great demo of this because it's slightly different in the online version, which is how I'm sharing my screen right now. But if I, for example, wanted to just insert a regular chart, which I might do from my little demo data right here, I can do insert chart from my ribbon and I can pick what chart I might want to make, okay? So if you haven't played with charts before, just take a couple minutes, select your data, create a chart, create a pivot chart, just get a sense for kind of the layout options, click around a little bit. I found that's the best way to get the hang of charts.
I'm thinking of doing it. I've got some times to make average in this category. So I like kind of like wanted to double check, but I don't know if like I did anything.
Oh, so what's this product formula that you're using?
Which is also like what I'm expecting for this.
Yeah. So let's go back to if you can just go up to your formula editor there. Backspace one. I want to push a little. Yeah, you typically, if you just, yeah, there you go. Great. All right. Interesting. It's just multiplying together. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on the distribution of the data, right? Like if they're skewed to one direction, it's not gonna be exactly.
Like what, just how it's going to change. Like the numbers, I'm wondering. Cause I'm not sure if I did it all.
Okay, so you started this because you thought which number was wrong?
Like I was thinking, I was like mathematically or like arithmetically, I should have thought that like this, not the same amount of monthly down should be the sum, like.
Okay, but I think some of our monthly downloads are blank on our source data. For example, if you go to your shows,
Yes.
like our monthly, so yeah, monthly downloads are missing on a few of these,
okay.
so that's gonna.
Oh,
yeah,
okay,
that's what it
thank
is.
you so much.
Yeah, no problem. All right, how we doing with charts? Everybody get at least one chart to show up. Their data. All right, great. Cool. Okay, I'm not gonna get super far into the charts because we're gonna do more charts next week when we talk about putting together a whole dashboard project. And they're a little bit more kind of like drag and drop kind of visual preference than anything else. But if you have questions about charts, I will leave a few minutes for questions as we go. Okay, a really important sort of different note, so kind of moving from charts, but this applies to pivot charts as well as pivot tables, is some important notes for when you're adding or editing data. Okay, this part only applies to Excel. Google Sheets has actually like solved this problem and you don't have to worry about this in Google Sheets, but if you're in Excel, this is really important to know. So I selected all the data in my shows tab and I used that to create my pivot table, right? That's what we all did in this last exercise. Let's say my network adds 100 more shows next week. So I add 100 more rows to my shows tab. Awesome. You would think my pivot table would maybe just update and bring those new sort of 100 new rows into my table. It's actually not going to do that until I explicitly tell it to refresh. All right, so I will demonstrate what that means. Let's say I come over here and I add an order number 11 and it's a drip coffee, which is, paste down my price here. Paste. All right. So I've added some information. I'm going to come over to my pivot table here, but I need to tell it about this additional drip coffee. So it still has just my 15 items, and I should have now just added a 16th item. Okay, so it only has my original 15 items. This one that I added is not being reflected in my pivot table because I have not gone to my special pivot table ribbon and hit refresh. All right, once I do that, I hit refresh in my pivot table ribbon. It's going to do some thinking and update, but I'm still not getting my drip coffee, right? So I've hit refresh, I'm still not getting my drip coffee. That's where I'm going to need to use also in my ribbon, my change data source. Now, this is a little weird because I'm not changing my data source. I'm sort of editing my data source. All right, but this is where our absolute cell references come back to haunt us. Okay, so when you select a pivot table, it automatically makes everything an absolute cell reference, meaning it puts a $ in front of everything. So if I had been paying a little bit more attention when I created my pivot table, I might have just given it a few more rows at this moment, right? I might have just extended my range anticipating that I'm going to add some data. I did not do that. So it's locked here to only go up to D21. If I change this to D22, I accidentally deleted the whole thing instead. Let's get back to my pivot table. I'm going to do my change data source. Zoom thing out of the way. Okay. I'm going to change this to go down to D22 instead of just D21. All right, and great. All right, so now I've got my 16th drink. I've updated that. All right, so there's two things you need to remember. One is if you change your data, you're going to need to refresh it. And if the refresh doesn't catch it, you'll need to actually go and make sure it's all still selected. So for example, let's say I had given this customer drip coffee is normally $3, but I've given them a discount for some reason. All right, their drip coffee is going to be $1. All right, if I come back over to this is still 18% of my total revenue. That percent actually should have changed a little bit when I changed the price. But if I come down to my pivot table, I hit refresh, I see it changed to 16. That changed all my other percentages. So even though I came over to this sheet and I made my edit, my pivot table actually didn't reflect that edit. That can be a little annoying. So you have to remember to hit refresh. Typically when you're creating a pivot table, if you expect to be adding data, I would recommend that you select a bigger range in that moment when you start. Okay, so if you're expecting that you're going to add data, I would just select all those stuff you want to start with and then give it a few more rows from the get-go. That'll save you a little bit of grief. Okay. Google Sheets does not have this. So Google Sheets, if I had gone over and discounted this to $1 and just clicked back over here, Google Sheets would have already figured that out and updated that for me, which is pretty nifty. Okay, fantastic. Right. Great, and then any chart that's sort of attached to your pivot table, once you've made those updates, the pivot chart will update along with your table. Again, we'll talk more about sort of setting those all up next week when we talk about, or next session when we talk about dashboards, which is actually falling in a couple weeks. All right, okay. So we're going to do one more exercise here, which is to give you a sense of what happens when you change your source data and give you a chance to practice refreshing it to make sure you can get that to work. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to sort of force an artificial change, which is to say that our technology category of shows is being relabeled from technology to tech. Okay, that's happening. The corporate change, I had no say in the matter. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to make that change on our shows sort of tab here on our shows worksheet, and then go and make sure that that gets reflected in our kind of first table that we made tonight, as well as in our pivot table. Okay, so the way that you're going to do this is come to your shows tab. You're going to do Command F, which is how you're going to get find. This is just our artificial change, but this is also very helpful for kind of cleaning up data. And you're going to do a find and replace. All right, so you're going to type in the word that you want it to find and type in the value that you want it replaced with. You can replace it with anything. I was going to suggest we replace it with tech. What I'm going to do is you can either hit replace individually and it'll sort of click through each individual value and replace each one as it finds it. I'm just going to hit replace all. All right, so all I did was Command F or Control F if you're on a PC. Grab my replace option, and I'm just going to replace the word technology as it appears on this tab with some other word. Could be tech, could be waffles, could be whatever you want. Okay. All right, I'm going to replace all of those. Does it replace 50 of them? Fantastic. And I can just sort of eyeball, right, in my data that it looks like it worked, right? These ones that used to say technology now say tech. All right. So I'm going to come back over to, so you should all make that same change or a similar change. And then I want you to go back to the table that you made in our first exercise tonight and in the pivot table that you made for tonight. Okay, so if I go over to the original table I made tonight, I'm getting an error. It's weird with this. Let me bring it back. Okay. All right, great. So oh, I just undid my find. That's why. Do my find one more time. Sorry. Okay. Command F replace. Run that again. Fantastic. Okay. Cool. All right. So when you come to your table, looks like I did some other edit that messed this up. But I'm getting an error here now because it's going to look for my technology podcast and I don't have any podcasts. I don't know how I got this down here. Paying attention earlier. Okay. But I'm now getting an error. And so to fix this in my, so this is my non-pivot table, I would have to come here and manually edit this one to also be tech in order for it to pull the right number. And it should be in the same row. So sorted it wrong. So I'd have to fix that error. Now, to fix that same thing in my pivot table, which is here. So my pivot table still says technology. My pivot table though doesn't have an error, right? It's still got my average, it's still got my sum, it's still got my count. My pivot table is feeling good, but it's still reflecting this old category name. So the way that I would fix that in my pivot table, instead of manually typing, is I would come into my pivot table ribbon up at the top and I would hit my refresh all. And you'll see then it's updated itself to be tech and it brought its numbers along with it. All good, no typing required, but I had to remember to hit this button. All right, so again, just another sort of like trade-off example of these tables. One you have to type, the one you have to remember the button. Up to you which you prefer. All right. I think we're gonna save conversations about charts more for next week because I want to talk about that when we do dashboard design. So yeah, I think that's all I have for tonight because I moved some of this to our next session. So yeah, that's all I got. So the way the rest of this session is going to work, our last sort of capstone of our Excel series is going to be covering data dashboards. So it's going to be taking together the formulas we talked about, tables, charts, pivot tables, etc., and kind of how to put that all together into a bigger dashboard project. So that one will be a little bit less of me talking, a little bit more hands-on time, but still in sort of like a guided format. With you all and a good chance to practice, and you should come out of it with a nice sort of example spreadsheet dashboard that you could use if you have a portfolio or something like that. Okay. I did also want to take a few minutes and talk about the series that we're going to do after that. So after our data dashboard session, I'm kicking off another series here at the Digital Lounge teaching SQL and Python. Which is open to anyone who has never, if you've never heard of or touched either of those things before, this is for you. If you've dabbled in them a little bit, also great to come on down and kind of learn a little bit about SQL and Python. If you were able to do our Excel formulas and kind of follow along in these sessions, you can do basic SQL and Python, and I would love to have you in our session. So if you have any questions about that, if you want to come talk to me, it's a separate registration on the Digital Lounge website. I think we have a former student from one of those in here as well, came back for Excel. So I can vouch that you'll keep coming back. But yeah, it's a great time. And so SQL and Python are essentially more powerful versions of everything that we just did in Excel. So if you have interest, if you want to learn a little bit, it's another thing where knowing just a tiny bit is a lot better than knowing zero. So we'll do 5 sessions of that starting after the Excel series ends. Just the date on the next Excel session is a couple weeks away because you all have a break and then I'm out of town. So it is going to be a couple weeks, but I hope to see you all there. It'll be a chance to kind of review all of this. As you're going to all of these sessions, there's a Digital Lounge feedback form. If you have any comments that you'd like to share there, please feel free, or you can shoot me a note. Okay, I think that's all I got for tonight. I'm going to hang out if you have questions about your pivot table, formulas, any of the stuff we've covered so far. Happy to chat. And otherwise, I will hopefully see you all on March 3rd to put together a dashboard. Cool.